The world is changing so fast. We need to find new ways. We all need to open our consciousness. I want to invite great personalities to make you discover new phenomena, stunning pathways, amazing ways of healing, and new ways of perceiving reality. The world is not what you think. All around us, many phenomena still remain a total mystery. Follow me, and let's explore together Unexplored Roads.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to receive you once more for a new episode today. A new territory, new land, cryptozoology. And with us tonight, we have the privilege to welcome Jeff Meldrum, who is a professor of anatomy and anthropology in Idaho. He's an expert on footprints, morphology in primates, and above all, he still has a strong interest in legendary creature called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So hello, Jeff Meldrum. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me. My pleasure.
That's very, very intriguing because it's part of one of the greatest mysteries of our century.
I think so.
It deals with mankind, the place of humanity on Earth, and it's very intriguing and quite a complex subject.
Yes.
There are many skepticals and many folklore, cliche, legends. So with you, we will try to decipher the truth and perhaps the legendary part of it. So first and foremost, perhaps the best and the most important question we have, do you have true evidence that show the existence of Bigfoot?
Mm-hmm. Well, my expertise, as you mentioned, is in evolutionary morphology, and particularly the evolution of bipedalism and the footprint evidence associated with that through the fossil record, and of course all the comparative studies that involve living primates and humans. And so the footprints, that's my forte, that's my expertise, and so it makes the greatest impression on me. And so, as many of my colleagues have said, not many, a few colleagues that were willing to go out on a limb. Dr. John Napier was a British primatologist, and he concluded his scholarly treatise on this subject by saying something is leaving footprints. What it is exactly remains to be determined, but he came down in favor of the likely existence of Sasquatch. And it's evidence like this. I mean, these huge oversized footprints, but they're not simply enlarged facsimiles of a human foot, nor are they the product of crude carved wooden feet strapped to hiking boots. I mean, they show the anatomy of a living organism. They show the distinctions from the human condition that one would expect for the foot associated with a large, giant primate, bipedal primate, inhabiting very broken, rugged, mountainous, forested territory. And, they're broader, they don't have the arch, they distribute weight more evenly across the foot. They have a greater degree of flexibility in the joints to negotiate that uneven terrain, and so on. The anatomy is really quite intriguing, and they show the signs of animation. Here's one people look at and they say, well, doesn't that have an arch like a human? Well, a very flexible foot can twist as it accommodates changes in direction and changes in inclination, and of the substrate. And that action we call in the foot supination and pronation, or inversion, eversion, a combination of those movements. And so in some footprints, you do see a transient raising of the medial side of the foot, not in the fashion of a fixed longitudinal arch, as in a human foot, but a distinctive morphology that is characteristic of the primitive conditions found in non-human ape feet. So as you can see, I I don't mean to wax too technical, but as you suggested as we were discussing prior to this conversation, it's a very complex. This isn't just a simplistic, oh, there's these boogeymen in the woods. The science is of the anatomy, of the ecology, of the behavioral observations. It is extremely complex and yet absolutely consistent with what one might envision for a relic population of non-human primate, be it ape or early hominid, relative. It's absolutely consistent and finds in the current paradigms of anthropology and zoology a context that where in the lack, even in the face of definitive conclusive evidence, any rational individual should ask, why aren't there other species when in just the very recent past, geologically speaking, there were multiple species of upright bipedal human-like creatures that lived right alongside Homo sapiens across this planet. And it's only in our accepted norms, it's only been in the last 30,000 years that we presume that we are now the last hominin standing, and none other accompanies us, which is a strange conclusion to draw in the face of so much evidence that there are other species like the Sasquatch or the Chinese Yeren or the Himalayan Yeti or the Russian almas. I mean, the list just goes on. It's not just a singular event here of wacky Americans thinking that there's a boogeyman in the forest.
And is it the same species? You mentioned Yeti and Siberian man. Is it the only kind of species, or are there many kind of these kind of things?
I believe both on the basis of the descriptions, or let me rephrase that. I've concluded. I don't like to use the word belief because it carries such connotation, but concluded on the basis of the eyewitness descriptions, but even more fundamentally, again, from my area of expertise, looking at the footprint evidence, there appears to be at least 3 different or 4 different types. And so, in other words, we know that there was this extremely bushy family tree, and at any time in the past, there were multiple upright bipedal primates of various stripe, and that also that some of those branches on that bushy tree have persisted until remarkably recently in the known fossil record. So we look at the Sasquatch footprints, and based on some of those distinctions I drew attention to, we see continuity across the Bering Land Bridge into Asia. So a kind of a circum-Pacific distribution into Eastern Asia, even over west as far as the Caucasus Mountains. I have example of footprints that, you wouldn't be able, if I set them on my lab bench amongst a sample of Sasquatch, alleged Sasquatch tracks, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They're all the distinctions I mentioned are included there. With the Yeti, we have a creature, the best footprint evidence suggests it has a divergent big toe or hallux, like an ape. So it may be a relic population of sort of semi-terrestrial ape that still relies on the trees in the canopy for resources and refuge, inhabiting those subtropical forests in the high valleys of the Himalayas rather than the bleak snowfields. I mean, tracks are found there just because they're, as other animals like bears and so forth, they're moving from one valley to the next, and they cross those same passes. There's also then a form that, interestingly, is much more human-like. The Russian almas, those reports tend to come from areas of the known, based on the archaeology and paleontology, distribution of Neanderthals, or perhaps Denisovans. Now we've got other Neanderthaloid type species that we have to sort out as more and more evidence comes forth. But this creature is more human-sized, more human-like in behavior. I mean, covered with hair still, very, hirsute, a wild man image, but yet it attempts to imitate language of humans. It attempts to trade goods with humans. It has a more complex social system, it seems. It's more human-sized. And so, it really fits. One has to wonder. We have evidence of challenge. The dating has been challenged, but anywhere from 10 to 20,000 years ago. I mean, that's just a snap of the fingers. Why would we exclude that? And then finally, we come to the little people. Not to subsume all of the traditions globally of little people, leprechauns and Martians and so forth, but in particularly in Southeast Asia, where we know there were persistent presence. There was the persistent presence of a small diminutive hominin, namely Homo floresiensis, the hobbit. It was a kind of, I found it a bit amusing when those very serious paleoanthropologists would sort of begrudgingly acknowledge that, well, yeah, the local people here on the island of Flores have been telling us stories about little hairy people that live up in the mountains. And it's very interwoven into their folklore, the idea that there were these other people. And those descriptions can be found rather prolifically throughout the islands of Southeast Asia and the mainland, and go by various names, as you might expect. But probably the most famous, the most widely popularized, was the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, the little people of the forest. And if Homo floresiensis is the model, there we may have a relic Australopithecine, or very early form like a Homo habilis that has persisted. The greatest affinity between the skull cranial remains are with those species. I reviewed the paper that came out in Nature for another journal, and focusing on the postcrania. And I was amazed as I considered this very closely, that there were aspects of the postcranial skeleton that were reminiscent of chimpanzees. I mean, they were clearly very primitive in many of their characteristics. And, their foot has this disproportionately long foot with not a divergent big toe, but yet there's a pretty good gap. And the big toe is much shorter than these long curved lateral digits. It's not a human-like foot at all. And so it raises all kinds of interesting questions of what the adaptation of this otherwise bipedal creature was, that had such an odd, flat, flexible foot with strange toe proportions that in many ways were reminiscent of some of the characteristics associated with Sasquatch foot. When I suggested that the Sasquatch foot exhibited a combination of traits that included a flat, flexible instep with a very, a much greater range of motion through the mid-tarsus, which is a primitive trait carried over from the hominoids, combined with a non-divergent big toe. However, some of my colleagues said, well, that's incongruous. It doesn't make sense to combine those two features. And yet, in the popular press, when the descriptions of the Hobbit, Australopithecus, Homo floresiensis, they described flat, flexible feet like floppy clown feet.
Mm.
You know, exact same description, and yet now it's not so inconceivable that such a combination could exist in nature. We run into that time and time again uh, where and I find this so fascinating, where things that are characteristics or aspects of Sasquatch or these other unrecognized relic hominoids historically were considered to be simply inconceivable. They made no sense. And yet now, with 2020 hindsight, as we've discovered more and more, for example, the Patterson Gimlin film is a really interesting case in point. When it was viewed by American scientists at the Smithsonian, most were very negative, and not surprisingly so, because, pardon me, not surprisingly so, because at that time in the 60s, we had a very different concept of the pattern of human evolution. As I mentioned, we now see it as this bushy tree with lots of parallel contemporaneous branches. But at that time, it was thought, in the vein of one of the central tenets of ecology, the niche hypothesis, you could have one species for one niche. No two species could occupy a single niche, but one would drive the other to extinction. And so it was thought the hominin niche, braininess, bipedalism, culture, that's a pretty exclusive club, and there can be only one species. And so it was thought that there were no, I mean, that human evolution had sort of proceeded in this rather single file march, with one species occupying the niche, with changes over time as varying conditions came and went. And so when in the 60s, when that single species hypothesis was in its heyday and the Patterson Gimlin film was viewed, it couldn't exist. There just was no accommodation for it to exist. So basically, they just looked for reasons to dismiss it. Well, Napier was probably the more open-minded of the group, and he, as I pointed out, he was quite impressed with the footprint evidence, being a primate functional morphologist and one specializing in primate locomotion. But when it came to the film, you know, he kind of joined with the group and gave it the thumbs down. But he said really the only thing he could put his finger on to dismiss it was that when he looked at this creature, again, from the point of view of a comparative anatomist and primate locomotion specialist, he said from the waist up, it looks like an ape. But from the waist down, its proportions and morphology is human-like. He said it's virtually inconceivable that such a combination, such a hybrid could exist in nature. So it must be fake. Well, about 3 years after his book was published, we had the sensational headlines about the discovery of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And it was, the first good look at associated elements of the skeleton that included the pelvis and the knee and portions of the foot that clearly showed that this was a bipedally adapted hominin. But in the popular press, how did they describe it? Isn't this interesting? They'd say, from the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, that was the linchpin for Napier. That was the one catching point that prevented him from giving the film a thumbs up. I often wonder what would have happened if the timing had been a little different and his book had not been published until several years following that discovery. You know, how would that section have read? Would he have had the integrity, the gumption to acknowledge that I can't point to anything in this film that is contrary to the science of the time? So anyway, give you a chance. I'm sorry I get
that's
verbose.
quite important to mention it. And this film is quite considered as a true one, or is it
Well, it depends on who you're asking. And even amongst the Bigfoot community, there are differing opinions, obviously, but it is generally not acknowledged as being credible. I myself am extremely positive about its authenticity. I mean, as much as one can rationally be in the absence of having been there and witnessed the event in person. But short of that, I mean, if I had just the footprints associated with that event, which were well documented, both by way of film and also photographs of other people who visited the site shortly afterward. A series of photos were snapped by a U.S. Forest Service employee, a timber cruiser, who was working in that area, marking out timber for salvage harvesting. And he and his crew visited the site after hearing stories about what had transpired and realizing that it wasn't very far from where they were working in the field. So they went in search of the location, and sure enough, I had a chance to visit with him by telephone, and he was no longer with the Forest Service. He had advanced up to the number 2 slot and then retired and went back to Colorado, where he works for the Parks Department, State Parks and Recreation. And he and I asked him point blank, I said, well, you were there on the scene. I said, well, I mean, what did you see? Was there anything to suggest anything untoward had occurred, like rehearsals or manipulation of the circumstances? And he said, no, it was just, he said there was one line of tracks, these giant oversized tracks, and then there were boot tracks and horse hoof prints all over the place where the witnesses claimed to have investigated and trammeled and so forth. But he saw nothing that would suggest anything other than what had been described had transpired. So I got down a side road on that. I was trying to, I mean, there've been lots of different suggestions about the nature of the film. I mean, I have lots of interactions with people behind the scenes, and academics who are not willing to openly discuss their thoughts, and especially in the in the upcoming generation, who weren't steeped in those paradigms that precluded the possibility of such a creature. They're much more open-minded, but yet the shadow of those prevailing ideas of the 60s still cast their influence, great distance into the present. And that old guard is still there. They still comprise the department chairmen and college deans and society presidents and symposium organizers. They're still the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And so I was going to mention, that was what it was. I was going to mention that I actually presented an analysis as a poster presentation at the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. And to my knowledge, it was the first and only time that film had been discussed in that venue. And so I wanted to be sure that it made a good, well, not a good, I mean, it's not a good or bad, but that it made a resounding impression. So I made arrangements, even though it was a poster session. I prefer a poster session. When I've done podium presentations on this topic, there's no discussion, there's no questions, because no one will dare raise their hand and ask a question. There might be some snickers in the back corner, the back row, and some snide remarks sent my way, but there's a chilling effect of that confined presentation venue. But with a poster, I get lots of interaction. And sometimes people will actually pull me aside or around the corner to tell me their story or ask about their interest or their concern or what's transpiring. so as not to be, I mean, just, it's a little funny here, but there was a moment when I stepped away from the poster during a brief interlude just to get a drink of water. And as I came back, I could see someone there looking at the poster on this occasion. And I always make, a set of miniatures of the poster and have them hanging from the bulletin board there in an envelope for onlookers to help themselves to. And this individual was reading the poster very intently. And then as he got down to the end, there was the envelope. But before he reached to take one, he looked over his shoulder one way and then the other way and stuck it into his bag very quickly and turned and walked away without further ado. So that little vignette just really was informative, I thought, and indicative of the unfortunate oppression of novel ideas, of ideas that are considered unorthodox. But on this occasion, I had arranged, sort of unconventionally, had a video monitor, and I'd prepared back in the day of VHS tapes, I'd prepared a tape with multiple renditions of the film, the raw footage, slow motion, close up, still frames, and so forth, and this played in a loop the whole time my poster was up there and visible. I also arranged and had a small table set up in front of my poster where I could lay out a selection of exemplary footprint casts. And so many of these scientists had never hefted one of these casts. I'm telling you, there's a difference seeing a picture in a book or on television when you actually have the opportunity to look at and turn in the light and view the details and the size, comprehend the enormity of these footprints. And there would be people sitting there just watching this video play. And of course, all they had ever seen were the little jerky snippets that the documentaries like to use. And the blurrier and scratchier and jitterier, the better, because it lends this sort of mystique to it, this sort of campy feeling of something not quite clear, somewhat, not perfectly distinguishable. And when you see the real raw footage, especially when you see a stabilized version where the motion jitter and blur and so forth is compensated for, it's an impressive piece of film. And all the allegations that it's so blurry that you can't use it for anything, it's blurry and indistinguishable, are just baseless. The camera that was used had a fixed focal length lens, so anything from 2 feet to infinity was in focus. It's just that it was far enough away that on a 16 millimeter film frame, you have an object that's 1.8 millimeters, and you're blowing that up to fill the screen. Now, most people today, few will remember grain in an actual film emulsion. We're in the digital age, so I compare it to pixels, but it's a little different. And just as an image, though, gets pixelated as you enlarge it, if it's low resolution, when you enlarge a film image beyond the capacity of the grain, then you get a grainy image, and that's true. That's true of it. But it's in focus. It is in focus. There's a little bit of motion blur because he had the dial, the frames per second dialed down. That's been clearly determined to about 16 to 18 frames per second instead of 22 frames per second, which is why many times when you see it on broadcast television, they'll play it at 22 frames per second because that's the industry standard. So it makes it look sped up. So it's walking real herky-jerky and looks like, like something from Keystone Cops. It's from a vintage cinematography. And when it is played at the proper film speed, then you get the sense of the massiveness, literally the mass, with the moments of inertia, of the swing of these massive arms and legs, and that body, that center of gravity moving through space. And it's obvious that it's not just a man in a billowed out fur suit.
Sure.
It's the real thing.
Yeah,
So,
the film is quite impressive. I will put some pictures for those who don't know yet this kind of footage. But I have a new question. You are specialists about footprints, but have you found some hair that
yes.
you analyzed? I mean, with technology and DNA techniques, perhaps you get some results you could share.
It's been a challenge and a frustration on one side of that, because let's look at, you said the analysis can have two dimensions. It can be a morphological analysis. You put a hair under a light microscope and you compare it to a series of standards and see if you find a match. And the hairs that we find interesting, and of course, the only way to know that a hair is from a given species is to either directly extract it from that species, until you have that one-to-one correlation, or to make a comparison to a known standard for that species. Well, we have no known standard for Sasquatch. So all we're doing is comparing it to other animals, and invariably the conclusion has been by independent labs that it's indeterminate. And that's the only conclusion they can rationally come to, because they don't have a Sasquatch standard to say, aha, it's Sasquatch. But what we did then is we went back and we started comparing all of these indeterminate samples, and lo and behold, they are identical to one another. And so we've got hair collected independently in time and space by different individuals that all show a consistent suite of distinguishing characteristics, very similar to human hair, but different. One of the key characteristics, and then this is the wrinkle, and that is one of the key characteristics is the lack of a cellular medulla, meaning a hair shaft basically has three components. It has a cuticle, it has a cortex, which is made up of keratin, an extracellular protein, and then it has a central core or medulla. And that medulla usually, more frequently than not, has the remnants of stacked up cell fragments that are from the bulb, from the follicle. And that the presence, there's very distinctive morphologies and dimensions, proportions of the medulla that are characteristic of different families and species of mammal. The lack of the cellular medulla is not mysterious. Some humans lack it, particularly individuals with very fine blondish hair, toe heads, because the central core lends more rigidity to the hair shaft. It stiffens the hair shaft. And so we have all these samples that are either human or they're some unknown primate, because they can be distinguished from many human hairs, the fact that they haven't been cut, the fact that they lack that cellular medulla. Now, the cellular medulla, I started to say, was the wrinkle, because when you have a dissociated hair, one that has just been shed, hair goes through a cycle where eventually the follicle becomes quiescent and the hair slides out and a new one begins to grow in its place. Yeah. And during that period of quiescence, the cellular content of that bulb is greatly reduced. And also, if there isn't the core, there just isn't very much by way of cellular material, i.e. nuclei and mitochondria, where one finds DNA, to extract. And so more often than not, we have a hair attributed to Sasquatch that, quote, fits our inferred gold standard of characteristics for distinguishing the Sasquatch hair, but it comes back either no DNA was successfully extracted,
Mm.
or if DNA is extracted, it's determined to be human. Well, and so one of two conclusions usually are offered. Either one, there was contamination through handling of the specimen by the collectors, or two, it's simply a misidentified human hair, because as I said, many of the characteristics are very similar. But there's a third possibility that has gone unaddressed. These tests are usually pretty circumspect, very superficial, looking maybe at one locus, one gene or a part of a gene for a particular marker that's been demonstrated in the past to be useful in distinguishing particular groups of species. But when we're looking at Sasquatch, if Sasquatch is something very, very close, of a close affinity to humans, we may be talking about a difference in percentage of identity between the sequence of, less than 1%, less than maybe 0.1%. We look at humans and chimps that are separated by 7 to 9 million years of time in their evolutionary history. And depending on which part of the genome one looks at, it could be anywhere from 94 to 96 or 98% identity. So, you can look at that one of two ways. That in one way says we're 98% chimpanzee. And the things that separate us from them are rolled up in that 2%, 2 to 6 or 8%. So I've quizzed many different geneticists, and I've said, are we going about this the right way, or are we doing enough to conclude, based on a very superficial comparison, that these are actually different species? And they say no. The example I like to give is, I don't know how widespread the tradition is in other European countries, but I spend a lot of time in Germany, and of course they love their Advents calendars leading up to Christmas. And so you have 24 little doors, and the nice little chocolate sweetie or a goodie or something behind each door as you work your way up. Well, imagine we had an Advents calendar with 1,000 doors, 1,000 little flaps, and if this creature differs by less than 1%, we might expect to find some distinguishing information in the sequence, and each door represents a certain little part of the DNA, but behind 10 of those 1,000 doors. And so if it's, that would be 1/10 of 1%, I guess. But we only have enough funding and a lab that's willing to dedicate enough man hours to open 10 doors. So by opening those 10 doors, what are the odds that we're going to, even assuming that the distinguishing markers or differences, substitutions in the sequence are rather uniformly distributed through the genome, which they're probably not. What are the odds that you're going to open a door that has a little bit of sequence, a marker that will give you a distinction between your two samples? And if you don't find that, what is the conclusion drawn after opening 10 doors that look exactly like human DNA? Well, they usually conclude it is probably human DNA. So that's the challenge that we're with. So there've been a lot of, I know there've been a lot of claims otherwise about Sasquatch DNA, about hybridization, about having a mitochondria that's essentially indistinguishable from humans. So there must have been interbreeding with a human female and a pre-human or subhuman hominin of some sort. I mean, it's just taking one question and substituting with another mystery, but one that is really doesn't make a lot of sense, because that's not the way new species, sometimes new species arise from hybridization, but not usually not in this fashion. And so claims that there is Sasquatch DNA out there, all of those are pretty vacuous. I have not seen anything to justify any of those conclusions.
And what what do you know about the society of these Sasquatch? How many are they? Where do they live? Do they have a society, a language, a culture?
Right. Good questions. And many of those probably won't be answered until we first recognize or acknowledge. But there are some clues. There's some clues that point to kind of in my mind, a rationale by which we can bracket some conversation, some discussion. One, most of the sightings and almost all the footprints are of solitary individuals, not groups. And there's a few instances that are suggestive of, well, of maybe of consort pairs of a male and a female, or even a what has been interpreted as a quote nuclear family with a mom, dad, and kids. But I think some of those, I mean, one, for example, that has become a bit of a classic was the story of the Canadian who was abducted, claimed to have been abducted by a Sasquatch and hoisted up in his sleeping bag and carried off and unceremoniously dumped in this little box canyon where there appeared to be a little family group. But when you look at it, both the circumstances of his abduction, this male was away from the group for quite a number of days, and at least a day's travel or a night's travel of uninterrupted walking from the group when the man was reportedly abducted. While he was there, in the time he was interred with them, the male and the female were off doing different things, coming and going, bringing back different resources. I mean, it could have been just, again, a transient consort pair where the female was receptive to the company of the male. She had 2 offspring, but they were young adult almost, it seemed from the description, juvenile to young adult. Okay, anyway, so I think rather solitary, presumably extremely rare because of the difficulty finding sign and having encounters, the rarity of encounters. If we look amongst the great apes for any type of analogy, it's a little bit problematic because of the living great apes, which themselves are just relic populations, a little snippet of the diversity that existed during the Miocene, when there were literally hundreds of species of ape and exhibited a tremendous variety of not only morphology in terms of locomotion, but in ecology and habitats occupied and so forth. But if we look to the living great apes, each one has a different social structure, whether it's the gorilla and its harem, whether it's the fission fusion of the chimpanzees, patriarchal versus matriarchal in the bonobos, or in the orangutans, it is solitary. The males, rather than control access to a group of females, he controls access to a territory, which happens to overlap several females. And when those females are receptive to his companionship, they'll seek it out. And that's only 4 to 8 years, every 4 to 8 years, but spaced, intervaled, because the offspring spend a great deal of time with their mother, are very dependent on her for the early years of their life. Anyway, so if we can imagine Sasquatch, and it fits some of the anecdotal evidence, with a social structure of a dominant male that who defends or at least attempts to control. You really can't control a huge territory, because I'm going to suggest that territory is on the order of 1,000 square miles. So 30 by 30-ish, something like that. And then if you look, there are 2 other factors. There's one other factor and a correlation to support that factor, causative factor. There seems to be a good correlation of presence where the habitat is moist enough to make a productive forest, good understory, that where a large omnivore can make a living. And as such, there is also a remarkable parallel to the distribution and the bioclimatic factors that determined the range of black bears. There was actually a publication here not too long ago, an editorial in the Journal of Biogeography, where they were actually testing ecological modeling software packages. To make a long story short, to make their point of the potential pitfalls of these black box, packages, they tested some ostensibly bogus data, namely Bigfoot data that they gleaned from online databases. But that data produced this remarkably coherent ecological model. And so it could either be proposed as sort of tongue-in-cheek to say, hey, look, you can't trust this package because even Sasquatch data looks good. But the flip side, the other interpretation is, hey, this data really is quite remarkably consistent and coherent, and it produces this ecological model that is remarkably parallel to that of another large omnivore, namely a black bear. So anyway, take my state of Idaho and look at the topography and geography, and where is there sufficient rainfall to produce moist coniferous forests, and where do we find black bear in the state, and then how many of these sort of 1,000 square mile home ranges could you fit into there? And depending on how you slice it, there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of patchiness to the habitat and so forth. But Idaho has the most wilderness of any state in the lower 48. It has, a good more than 2/3 of the state is roadless wilderness area in the Rocky Mountains. I would come up with about 15 little plots, and of those and each plot would represent a male, and let's say a couple females and maybe an offspring or two. So just for easy math, let's say 5. So 15 times 5, 75 Sasquatch in all of Idaho. Now, to some people, that's like 75. I thought that was just one. But other people go, 75, a species can't survive with only 75. Well, that's just one state. That's just one state, and there's more terrain, obviously more states adjacent. But by comparison, there's 35,000 black bear in Idaho. So 150, and say that's not enough. So did I say 150? 75. 5 times 15, 75. So let's double it to 150, or quadruple it to 300, or treble it. That's still the order of magnitude difference between 35,000 and say 300 or 350 or whatever. And then you start to understand why it's so difficult to find evidence of Bigfoot, why it's so difficult to find a body. Where are the bones? Well, how often does a Bigfoot die in the state of Idaho? And who's going to be around to find it if 2/3 of the state is roadless area, And then your other questions about going beyond, there's quite a schism in the Bigfoot community between people like to pigeonhole. They're not able. Many people are not, I guess, intellectually nimble enough to keep two balls in the air for conversation's sake and discussion. But the two ideas that polarize the community are, it's just an ape, quote, just an ape, meaning it's on this side of the split between hominins, human ancestors, and other apes, African apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees, or that it's very, very human. And some people go so far as to say that, it's something like a Neanderthal or a Homo erectus, or even a variety of human, a Homo sapiens, just a Homo sapiens ferus, a subspecies, which I can't support or think of any validation for. So my argument is everything we see, the lack of material culture, the lack of home bases, the lack of a complex structure, there's some debate about their ability to articulate speech. And I think the evidence is very equivocal that they can. Their vocal repertoire seems much more similar to that demonstrated by other apes than by a human. And all of those things point to a non-homo, non-human. Well, and if you even if you want to extend the label of humanity to include all of Homo, all of the genus Homo, beginning with Homo habilis, or its ilk, clear back about 2.5 million years ago. If this thing is a hominin, in other words, if it's on this side of the split because of its bipedalism, if that's a singular adaptation to this clade, it would have to be a very early offshoot, a very, a primitive form, which are essentially bipedal apes, bipedal chimps. I mean, just like they described Lucy, from the waist up, including her cranium, she's basically like a chimpanzee, but she's adapted to standing upright and walking on 2 legs. So that's kind of where I'm at on that particular point. I mean, I think arguments could be made either way, but there's some remarkably interesting parallels. I mean, one time I took the skull of a hyper robust Australopithecus, namely Australopithecus or Paranthropus boisei from East Africa, which did persist up till about 800,000, close to 1 million years ago in East Africa. If you take that skull and you take the Patterson Gimlin film, blow up her face, and juxtapose those side by side, point for point, what's on the film reflects the remarkable adaptations of this very specialized hominin, one that has a brain that's not much bigger than a chimpanzee, but has evolved these massively deep jaws. The lower face is the dominant feature, deep maxilla and mandible, little incisors and canines that wear end to end instead of interlocking like with a shearing, sharpening mechanism, and massive premolars and molars. The occlusal surface of this little 5 foot, I shouldn't say little, but this 5'5" hominin dwarf, the molar surface area of the humans. It's like 4 or 5 times greater. If you want to call that human, and I haven't looked in, I must say, I haven't looked into Patty's mouth, and you can't really see her teeth, but many that report seeing Bigfoot teeth remark about how they're squared off. They don't have the monstrous canines that even chimps or gorillas or orangs would exhibit. And so why is that? Well, the only reason to have squared off teeth, well, there's 2 reasons. In the human lineage, they just apparently got smaller primarily because we didn't interact aggressively with other males in that way, unless we were going to pick up a rock or an external tooth, a cutting edge, and fight that way. The other way is to allow for greater side-to-side grinding on these rounded, puffy bunodont teeth. Instead of just being slicers and mashers, they literally were grinding. And so those end-to-end wearing canines allow for the jaws to grind in that fashion. Well, as I said, otherwise I haven't looked in Patty's mouth or any Bigfoot's mouth, but from the proportions that she exhibits, her flat face, her forward jutting cheekbones, and the angled head going right from the brow up, suggesting the presence of some sort of cresting for massive temporalis muscles. The only reason to have all that hardware is because you have giant teeth attached to those jaws. It would make no sense to have small teeth and all those massive features. So by inference, I think it's a pretty fair adaptation, and one which in retrospect makes perfect sense. For a large-bodied omnivorous primate in a temperate forest, the foodstuffs that they're going to be eating, they're not squishy figs in a tropical forest, but they're things like lichens and roots and tubers that have lots of gritty dirt around them, and you know, other coarse and tough food items that select for that kind of dentary adaptation. So a robust Australopithecine actually makes a pretty remarkably interesting candidate as an ancestral form, giving rise with increased body mass, gigantism during the Pleistocene, as did so many other mammal species experienced during that time, and especially in the northern latitudes. That's where the megafauna of the ice ages evolved. I mean, it all starts to fit. I mean, it's and I realize that this is, you know, there's an element of informed speculation or inference, drawing out conclusions from just little tidbits of clues, tidbits of information and observation. But that's what's interesting is the more that we align these little subtle observations of anatomy and behavior, a picture starts to emerge that's remarkably coherent with what one might expect, given what we now understand about the course of hominin evolution, what we now understand about the ecological adaptations of primate dietary and locomotor adaptations. I mean, it's remarkable. It really, it's remarkable. Anyway.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because in our minds, it's all kind of legend and folklore. How can you explain that academic or mainstream science tend to laugh at searchers as you or others? Why it is still so strange for us?
Well, it is. You know, I had the opportunity, I was invited to speak at Massachusetts General Hospital, very prestigious hospital, well known, and I was invited by the director of the podiatry unit, and he had invited, you know, I was the annual sort of banquet speaker, I guess you'd say, and so it was all the podiatrists from the hospital and the community, as well as there were a lot of orthopedic surgeons who came and attended as well. I mean, there's a room full of 75, 80 people, and I could sit there and talk shop like this about the and even more so about the nuances and subtleties of the anatomy of the footprints as evidenced, and even I showcased one very publicized case where it appears that the foot was deformed and was bent inward and had these prominent bunionettes on the side, and one of the toes was pushed up out of alignment so it didn't leave an imprint, and so on and so on. And they were just amazed. They were enthralled, and we were having discussions about the possible diagnosis. You know, was this a pathology? Was it a crushing injury? You know, what examples do we have? But yet how it looks different. It has a longer heel. It's much broader. The arch is missing, and so forth. They didn't have the baggage, the implication of the existence of such a creature did not have an impact on their careers or their reputation, you know. And so it was purely talking the data, looking at the evidence on its merits alone, regardless of the implications. And so it was very pure, very unadulterated, very refreshing to me. And yet, you know, I'll have someone, this is a direct quote, an anthropological colleague who said they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. Now, what a contrast in attitudes and you know, intellectual honesty between those two cases. And so, yeah, and you're right, there is this other aspect, and I find it very fascinating. In fact, right now I'm working on a book about Bigfoot because of some interactions with a colleague, with a cultural anthropologist in New Mexico, in the American Southwest, which most people, you know, envision desert, you know, Arizona highways, the red rock and arches and hoodoos and canyons and so forth. But the Colorado Plateau there is framed by several major mountain ranges, the Southern Rockies, the Aquarian Plateau, the Mogollon Ridge, and so forth, the Chusca Mountains and Zuni Mountains, which rise up, in the case of the Southern Rockies, more than 14,000 feet. And they catch, especially the moisture coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And so you have these very wet, temperate forests at elevation that are remarkably productive and have a forest habitat with all the animals, familiar to people who live in the much wetter, otherwise wetter areas like the Cascade Mountains in the Northern Rockies and so on. And so there is a tradition of Sasquatch. Anyway, my point is, though, that being a cultural anthropologist, my colleague has had close affinities to the Navajo Nation there in these southern states, who have recently been very forthcoming with their personal and tribal traditions and stories and experiences regarding the Yeetso, the big man, the big giant, as it's called. And so it's been very fascinating. We had an opportunity to interview a large number of tribal people sharing their experiences. And so taking advantage of that very singular opportunity, which doesn't happen very often, we're, with their permission, we're writing this book to kind of showcase the common threads of experience that are woven into these stories, which appear to, it does several things. It characterizes aspects of the anatomy and behavior of this strange creature. It introduces, the next generation to an animal or an entity, let's say, an entity that is somewhat taboo. It's not to be talked about, and in part because it's so similar to us.
Yeah.
Because it's anthropomorphic. It's, it plays many different roles. It's either monstrous. A common thread is cannibalistic. It eats humans, including children. And so it plays the role of a boogeyman. Children don't go out after it's dark. You don't wander too far from home. It sometimes is the trickster. Sometimes it's the patron. It's the protector. It's even the creator in some contexts. Because of its man-like nature, we were formed in its image, basically, standing upright instead of down on all fours, like other forest animals. And so, assuming that, and so these stories, which often imbue them with human-like characteristics, they can talk, they live in a house, they often have a family, whatnot. It humanizes, or it creates a sense of familiarity that allows, that sort of eases the listener to the story into the taboo world of this being. But the being is part of this world, oftentimes from the very beginning. It was, and interestingly, especially down there in the Southwest, in most cases, the creatures are thought to have arisen from some interaction between a more godlike being and a human female. And, we have, that goes back to, the Greeks with the demigods being spawned by intercourse between the Olympians and the fair maidens of humanity. So interesting themes, but it also attests to the fact that the notion of these creatures, or if you want to just limit it to that, the notion of these creatures, or I believe the recognition of the existence, their coexistence with these creatures on the landscape, goes way back. Goes back to the mists of time, the dawn of time, when the folklore, the traditions of these people were established. It far predates any idea or suggestion that Bigfoot was spawned in the 1950s when someone was traipsing around with fake feet, strapped to their boots.
Yeah.
Much more than that.
And perhaps there are some drawings like petroglyphs or rock art that
Yes,
represent this kind of beings. Do you
very
have
much so.
evidence, or do you have pictures about these
Oh
representations?
yes, one that a colleague of mine by the name of Kathy Strain, who's an archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service. She's in California, and the Yokuts tribe of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California have this pictograph. It's a painting on the rock face, and this is one of those instances where the hairy man, as it's called, and it's depicted with this massive creature with long hair and dark, deep-set eyes, and there is also a female and an infant, so it's like a family portrait, but lots of other animals and human stick figure-ish kind of depictions of humans. But the hairy man, this is this painted rock site. The story that goes with it is that the animals got together to discuss their plans to create humanity, and there was all sorts of suggestions and offerings of ideas about how humans should be formed, with what characteristics. The bear wanted to make them strong, and the fox wanted to make them clever, and the deer wanted them to be fleet of foot, that they could run fast through the forest. But the hairy man wanted them to stand upright like they did. And so there was no consensus. Eventually, it was decided there would be a competition, a race, and the winner of the race would then dictate the character of the created humans. Well, again, playing the trickster, the hairy man, took a shortcut or something, and he declared himself the winner and went ahead and created man in the absence of the other participants to look like him, standing upright at least on two legs. But when the humans saw this giant hulking hairy monster, they were afraid and ran away. Well, this broke the heart of the hairy man, and he's depicted with tears streaming down his face. And he vowed at that time that in order to avoid striking fear to the hearts of man, that the hairy man and his kind would inhabit the deepest parts of the forest and only be active at night to avoid contact with. And so here's the story that explains the similarity between us and them, and yet also explains the difference, the behaviors of the hairy man, nocturnal, solitary, very reclusive, and so forth.
So it's
Very fascinating.
very interesting, because you have some truth inside old myth and traditions, and it's a kind of the clues you can have for cryptozoology, like in Africa, for example, for the Mokele, the last dinosaur.
Right.
So it's quite interesting, and I would be interested in having this picture, this pictograph you mentioned.
Sure.
So perhaps, yes, we'll stay in touch, keep in touch. I have a personal question, if I may. So where and when and how did you get involved in this field? Because it's quite a strange passion for a great teacher as you, anatomy, anthropology. So
right. Well, I can trace its roots back, to my youth. My first exposure to the subject of Bigfoot was when I was about 10 or 11, fifth grade in school, and it was the year 1968, and Roger Patterson, I lived at that time in Spokane, Washington, the state of Washington, which isn't too far from Yakima, where Roger Patterson lived. And so when he began to show his film, he created a little simple documentary which showcased that 60-second film clip. created a context framework for it. And then he began to show it commercially in different venues, different cities. And one of the first showings was in Spokane, where I lived. And so I heard about this. The kids at school were talking about the advertisement in the newspaper. Someone had seen an advertisement somewhere. And and as a result, I ran home that day after school, and there in the paper found it, and persuaded my dad to take my younger brother and me to the showing. That was the first time I'd heard of Bigfoot, the first time that I'd seen the Patterson Gimlin film, larger than life, not on a little TV screen, but on the big silver screen. And it was impressive. And, one thing led to another. It became a fascination, because I was already involved in everything biological. I had my insect collections, and I would spend my time out in the woods collecting animals and catching, bringing home pets and all kinds of things. And I was also fascinated by the controversy surrounding evolution, particularly human evolution, and the idea of cavemen. And of course, I think all young boys and girls go through a dinosaur phase where they're fascinated with prehistoric life, and that a world that was very different than the world today. And, I could rattle off statistics about dinosaurs like other kids could rattle off baseball statistics, And, but in any case, that interest waxed and waned over the years. But whether that itself, or just the fact that dovetailed so well with so many of my interests and aptitudes, I ended up pursuing a career in anatomy with an emphasis in physical anthropology. There was one particular paper, because when I was in college, there was a paper that was published about the locomotor anatomy of Australopithecus afarensis by a team based at SUNY Stony Brook in New York, Long Island, New York. And that really made an impact. I mean, I was fascinated by the anatomy, by human anatomy, and the functional aspects of adaptations for moving, and especially, in part because of that forging of the passion or fascination with a bipedal primate like Bigfoot. I was very interested in the evolution of bipedalism in the human family. Make a long story short, that's how I ended up in the field of anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So I'm not really strictly an anthropologist in the classic sense, because this was an alternate route, which alternate career route, which was addressing the need for anatomists at medical schools, because most other traditional anatomists had become cell biologists. Departments of anatomy got more and more microscopic, and so they turned to anthropologists to fill the void left in teaching human gross anatomy to health professions. So the timing was very fortuitous for me, I think, because there were programs popping up all over the place where these anthropologists that had been recruited to departments of anatomy then developed programs in anatomical science, gross anatomy, histology, and so forth, and embryology, combined with physical anthropology, and that in the form of paleoanthropology, paleoprimatology, functional comparative anatomy of primates, and so forth, locomotor studies. And there was a kernel, cluster of faculty at Stony Brook that really attracted my attention, and that's where I ended up. So that kind of set the stage academically, and then a couple of things happened. There was a very interesting. This is part of the story that I don't often go into, but just to make it a little different for your viewers. I was always I was interested in cryptozoology as in general, because of my interest in zoology fundamentally, but particularly as it addressed relic hominoids. It was, it was the primate side of cryptozoology that really drew my attention. Although I was actually a charter member of the International Society of Cryptozoology, and actually became good friends and colleagues with Richard Greenwell, who ran that society. But it was one of the things I was interested in was the stories of Lois's ape in South America, because I had actually done in my graduate work, I did a lot of paleoprimatology in South America, looking at locomotor adaptations in fossil South American primates, and I went on digs in Patagonia and Colombia. But this notion of this big spider monkey looking thing that was supposedly 5.5 feet tall, tailless, and able to walk bipedally really caught my interest. And especially when a colleague of mine, another fellow graduate student, while in Brussels, had sort of exhumed some long lost fossils that had been described in a rather esoteric journal, non-English speaking journal that had not been widely publicized, of these giant fossils of giant monkeys found in Brazil. And shortly on the heels of that, another paleontologist who was focusing on Pleistocene sediments in caves in Brazil had uncovered 2 complete skeletons of these massive giant monkeys, 2 different genera, one that was very similar to a spider monkey and one that was similar to a howler monkey. But I mean, the spider monkey stood 5.5 feet tall almost. Mm. It was huge. I mean, its hand was almost the size of a gorilla's or a chimpanzee's. It was huge. And so, I was interested in that. Anyway, to make a long story short, a little late for that now, but I was in touch with Richard Greenwell trying to track down some of the photographic evidence, the original material of this giant ape, Lois's ape in South America. As a result of that interaction, he was very curious how I, as a anthropologist / primatologist, etc., how I perceived Bigfoot. I go, well, by this time, enough vacillation of interest had passed with no apparent progress or resolution to the question that I kind of set it aside. It was way in the back burner. And he said, well, should we ever have something, would you be interested in participating in its evaluation? Well, of course, sure I would. Who wouldn't? And literally a couple months later, he phones me, and the Cryptozoology Society had been presented with a piece of video imagery, allegedly shot in Northern California it was shot in California, of an alleged Bigfoot walking across the side road that this RV was on. And, quite honestly, I thought, this will be fun. This will be an exercise in forensics, just to identify the zipper, punch a hole in the balloon here. Well, he sent me a copy, and I began to work with it. I got some stats about the RV that they were in, the height of the headlights and the floorboards and so forth, and dimensions, and as well as other details of the site. And I couldn't find a zipper. In fact, I started finding clues about the anatomy, subtleties of the anatomy, the way it stood and walked. There were other aspects that were that have been unfortunately somewhat sensationalized, but essentially, it was a genital display, male genital display, which was not human-like, but was remarkably similar to what you would see in a chimpanzee, for example. And this really piqued my curiosity. And so anyway, that kind of sucked me in on it. And then, as it turns out, and we actually flew down to the site and did some forensic reconstruction. And, you know, I had to dust off my trigonometry and you figure out what the actual height of this creature was. And it was nearly 8 feet tall. It was just over 7.5, between 7.5 and 8 feet tall. No question about that. So whatever it was, man in a costume or real Sasquatch, it was big. And anyway, on the flight home, Richard reaches in his satchel and pulls out this little booklet, a little small thin book, well, not that thin, but a booklet about Bigfoot in the Blues, namely the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington state, extending down into northeastern Oregon. And he asked me if I would be willing to read this and write a book review for the Journal of the Society. So I did, and it was interesting. It was a compendium of columns written by a journalist who lived in that region, who had basically an outdoor column, but also a sort of a side fascination for all things Sasquatch. And so he often featured reports or discoveries and counts and so forth and history in his column. And the book kind of went through a decade of these columns, and very fascinating narrative. And he was a good writer, excellent, engaging writer. My question was, you know, is this reliable? Is his reporting reliable? So I had a laundry list of the principal characters and asked him, I got in touch with the author, asked if I could speak with him, first of all, but also would he provide me with contact information for these personalities, which he did. And I went down the list and visited with these folks, and they shared photographs and their stories, their anecdotes and so forth. And it was just fascinating, the amount of information. It turns out this was an area where, given its proximity to Washington State, where Grover Krantz, the leading academic at that time in the subject, had examined a lot of footprint evidence. In fact, in his book, Big Footprints, an excellent treatment of the subject, he featured very prominently examples from this area. And so I got his book and was, you know, reading and comparing and you know, looking at the relationships that he was pointing out and so forth. Eventually, I went and visited two of the principal characters, paid a surprise visit unannounced, and at that occasion, the one gentleman had collected, you know, he had made footprint casts at every opportunity, and those were rather frequent, disproportionately it seemed. But once I became familiar with the terrain in that region, both the geology, which there's a dominance of what we call glacial loess, this talcum powder, flour, soil sediment that results from the glacial action during the Ice Age, and it blows across the western United States and is particularly concentrated through eastern Washington and southern Idaho, and which makes for remarkable conditions, because this is, when it's dry, it's like stepping in flour and it picks up every detail. Or when it's wet, it's like clay, and so likewise it picks up the finest of detail. And this was the region where Dr. Krantz drew attention, first published attention write-up of footprint casts that had the very fine skin ridge detail preserved in them. Remarkable, interesting angle. And so as a result, and the other factor was that many of these secondary roads that were cut up into the Forest Service roads, logging roads or otherwise, were unimproved. They were simply graded dirt roads with no gravel. So they made for excellent tracking beds. So anything that crossed the road, especially in the spring and the fall, when there was more precipitation, would leave excellent footprints. And so this gentleman, Paul Freeman, had accumulated remarkable collection over a span of about 10 years. There were some 45 pieces, examples of footprints. In some cases, multiple footprints in a single trackway that he had cast. And so upon visiting him, he was very gracious to I was traveling with my brother, and invite us in, and I was asking questions. He pulls out boxes from the cupboard, from the closet, and starts laying out these footprints. And I'm just, I mean, there's something when, it's one thing to look at a copy like this, but when you pick up the original that still has the soil attached to it and in the nooks and crannies, and there's just something that's a little different about it. It's almost as if it has a a spirit of its own, and
an emotion.
Exactly. But it was extremely impressive, and I was pointing out details, and I was asking him questions about context and circumstances, and he said to me, well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see a fresh set of tracks? Yeah, exactly. I mean, my reaction was like, well, are you kidding? And I thought, well, who wouldn't? Of course, but are you kidding? And he said that he had just been, what he would do is, this was in February, about this time of year, and the snows were, would melt off and recede and reaccumulate in the foothill roads. And he would always drive these roads as soon as he could, as soon as they were navigable, and look for footprints in the wet soil. And he said, I just came back from a drive this morning. It was on a Sunday morning. And he said, and I found footprints. I'll be happy to take you up and show you. He said, I didn't bother making any casts. He says, at this point, unless they're perfect, or exceptional, distinction, I don't bother. He says, it's not worth it anymore. And so I'm going, well. So I said, well, hey, what have we got to lose? Let's go do it. So we went up, and anyway, I won't go into the details of the whole thing, but it was a very interesting unfolding of this, but impressive. It wasn't just a couple of footprints. There were 35, 45 unmistakable clear tracks in this stretch of a dirt road. And at one point it went off into the fallow fields. We were down in the foothills, just below the boundary with the forest. And they, this land was cultivated right up to the national forest boundaries. And we were on a little access road. And the tracks just were so animated. They, you could see the tension cracks, as the weight compacted and pulled this clay soil in. You could see where sometimes the toes would slide. They would flex to gain purchase. Other places they would, was walking on the flat and the toes were extended. And in fact, the weight hardly went through the toes. So the fourth and fifth were hardly touching. And most of the push off came from the front of the forefoot. There was evidence in the form of pressure ridges that showed the flexibility of the midfoot. This was the first experience that got me thinking, because I had observed this phenomenon as it was originally described in chimpanzees in laboratory chimps numerous times, and had taken pictures and films with it and so forth. And it was just, I was literally pinching myself because the realization was setting in that, my gosh, a Sasquatch just walked by here last night. They were so fresh that, again, because of the fine texture of the soils, there was evidence of skin ridge detail in some of the prints. They couldn't have been more than 6 hours old. And I just, eventually he was poo-pooing them. He was saying, oh, I wouldn't bother with these. And all the things that he pointed out as imperfections, for me, were the kinds of variations and signs of animation, so that it didn't look like a static artificial foot stamped into the soil. It clearly was a dynamic interaction of a living foot with the substrate. And so eventually we took him home, and I turned to my brother and I go, even if these aren't real, if they're fake, what a great case study to follow through with here, because it's not often that you have that kind of a sample. So we detoured down into town and looked for a hardware store and found some plaster and some other equipment, because we weren't prepared for this on this kind of a trip. Went back up there, and then we really laid it out. And I convinced myself that not only was this real, but it was different than what he had explained. I mean, if he had portrayed this, then he explained it to me in absolutely 180 degrees backwards of the circumstances. I mean, because we reconstructed what must have happened, and it was partly obscured when he drove his truck in, and he drove over some of the tracks and didn't realize that there were more tracks to be seen further away, which we found, and with no sign of his observation or presence. And man, yeah, it was just it's like I've often said, I enjoy fishing, but I don't have a lot of patience. I don't like standing in lines, for example. When it comes to fishing, if I catch a fish in the first little bit, first half hour or so, or first 5 minutes, then I'm great. I'll sit there the rest of the day, even if I don't catch anything, because I know that there are fish there. But if I don't catch a fish, I quickly lose interest and move on. And I've joked that I had this singular opportunity to witness an exceptional example of the footprints that just, figuratively set the hook deep. And I was, what has it been? That was in 1996. So it's been 25 years that I've still stuck with it, and I've had interesting experiences along the way. But short of that Patterson Gimlin encounter, So anyway.
It's quite fascinating story, because you crossed the pathway of this creature, and I think all the viewers and explorers will be just amazed about your story and the evidence and the scientific way of studying. It's not just folklore or just new age things.
Right.
It's really serious and very well grounded and documented. So that's very interesting. And I have just one question about other well-known creatures around the world in cryptozoology, like the Loch Ness monster.
Right.
What do you think? It's perhaps not your specialty, but
it's not. But it has always been one of the the iconic cryptids.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the recent analysis that was conducted by an international team using new methods of environmental DNA to test the waters of Loch Ness, Neil Gemmell from New Zealand. His result I found was fascinating. That applying that methodology, they came to the conclusion that there was some novel eel of some sort that might be at the root of the sightings and lore surrounding the Loch Ness monster. Interestingly, as it turns out, I had the opportunity to meet with, had a visit here in my lab from one of his former students, who has an interest in Sasquatch as well, and now has taken a job in California and was up here visiting, our Yellowstone National Park, which is not far from me. And anyway, he put us in touch. And so Dr. Gemmell and I are plotting, scheming, once COVID passes, to undertake a eDNA survey of the Pacific Northwest, look for Sasquatch, a non-human primate DNA in the samples. So that's on the horizon. I hope we'll be able to realize it before too much time goes on, but still travel restrictions and complications of working in the field.
Hope, and we are all excited to travel once more. And and this story is fascinating with the DNA stuff, and and there are other monsters in other lakes. I think in Canada or in Africa. So what is
there seems to be a whole tradition of lake monsters, especially in the northern latitudes, but even in other areas that you've mentioned. So I don't know what the what the basis for that is. And like I said, it's a little out of my wheelhouse. I'm not my expertise, but always fascinating. I mean, these examples for me just reiterate the fact that sometimes we become a little bit cavalier in our attitude about how much we understand this planet, and there still are corners and crevices and depths and dark forests that perhaps harbor things that will be a surprise.
And
when
even, yeah, and even recently in Antarctica, they found some species just behind the ice.
Yes.
So it's fascinating, and we have to keep humble.
Exactly.
Always, because we don't know everything, and it's quite fascinating. The story is still going on. So
definitely.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
My pleasure.
Your story, your passion, and the way you study it with very scientific methods, with open-minded, and so thank you so much, dear explorers. What do you think about Bigfoot? You could let and put comments. I will be glad to read you and answer to you. So Jeff, thank you so much for this show. And dear explorers, see you soon for a new episode. So take care. Goodbye.